You've canceled plans before and felt this inner relief. You thought you might feel guilty, but instead it felt like something heavy just lifted off your chest. But then almost immediately, you probably wondered if there's something wrong with you. Nothing is. But let me tell you about that relief and what it actually means. It's not laziness or some character flaw dressed up as a preference. That feeling is your nervous system exhaling. And the fact that you've been told your whole life to feel ashamed of it, that's worth examining. Because we live in a culture that has quietly, persistently treated solitude like a symptom. Like if you prefer your own company, there must be some wound underneath it, some attachment trauma or social anxiety. Any deficit that drove you inward. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. Sometimes that's true. But other times, a person just thinks better alone, feels more like themselves and recovers faster, loves harder, lives fuller alone. It seems like we're asking the wrong question. Instead of whether solitude is healthy or unhealthy, we should be asking why we were told it had to be one or the other in the first place. Picture someone. Let's call her Maya. She's in her late 20s, works in marketing, genuinely likes the people in her life. She's not shy or depressed, but every time a group trip gets planned, she feels a slow dread building in her chest about a week out. She goes anyway every time because not going feels like a character indictment. She comes back exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And for years, she assumed she just wasn't social enough, like a missing version of herself she hadn't grown into yet. It never occurred to her that she wasn't behind, that she could be wired to feel differently about certain things. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people, first published in the 90s, but still not widely recognized in mainstream psychology, found that around 15 to 20% of people have nervous systems that take in and process sensory and emotional information more deeply than others. Not more intensely, but more deeply. The distinction matters. These aren't people who cry at commercials because they're fragile, but those whose brains are quite literally doing more work per social interaction than the average person's running more processes. And when you're doing that, you need more time to defragment. It's how they handle energy management. So, when someone like Maya comes home from a group trip and needs days alone before she feels fully human again, she's not being antisocial. She's recovering from something that genuinely cost her more than it cost the person in the seat next to her. And yet, she will probably apologize for it. There's this persistent myth, and I want to be careful here, because myths exist for a reason, that human beings are inherently social creatures, and that any deviation from that is a deviation from health. And yes, humans are wired for connection. That part is real. John Cassiopo's decades of research at the University of Chicago showed that loneliness activates the same neural threat responses as physical pain. So we do need people. But the distinction between that and needing constant people is not the same sentence. What the research on chosen solitude actually shows is something more nuanced. Reed Larson, a psychologist who spent years studying adolescence and time alone, found that voluntary solitude that wasn't forced or punitive, was associated with improved mood and higher rates of self-reflection when people returned to social settings. The key word across all of this work is chosen. Forced isolation can be corrosive. Chosen solitude is, well, closer to the opposite of that. What's strange is that as a society, we've somehow conflated the two. We see someone eating alone and automatically feel sad for them. We see someone declining an invitation and assume rejection or depression. We build a social script where presence equals wellness and absence equals lack. And some people who prefer solitude have internalized that script so deeply they've spent years performing extroversion just to feel more normal. Think about what that does to a person over time. When you spend years masking a natural preference, not a flaw, a preference, you start to lose a thread back to what you actually want. You go to the parties, you fill the silence. You answer the phone even when you don't have the bandwidth for it. And all of that compounded creates this low-level exhaustion that people usually attribute to work, stress, or being busy. They never think to ask, what if I've just been living slightly outside myself for a very long time? Ask yourself that question and sit with it for a bit. Because when you finally stop treating solitude like it's a problem, it gives you uninterrupted access to your own inner life, and your inner self is where your values live, where your intuitions get sorted, and where those emotions you were too busy to feel during the week finally get processed. Solitude is a very specific kind of fullness that noise typically prevents. Maya figured this out around 31. Not through therapy, but a single weekend where her plans fell through and she just didn't refill them. She read. She cooked something slow. She sat with her own thoughts long enough to actually hear them. And she said later that it was the first time in years she felt like she was living in her own life rather than acting it out. People who are genuinely comfortable alone, not avoidant or shut down, tend to have a clearer sense of what they think before the room influences them, tend to feel more comfortable disagreeing, because they've already had the conversation with themselves first by interrogating their own positions in the quiet. It's a kind of cognitive independence that's become increasingly rare these days, and it's quite easy to romanticize. So, I want to be honest, solitude can also become a hiding place. It can be the comfortable face of avoidance. There's a version of this where someone isn't recharging. Instead, they're retreating alone, and only the person inside that experience really knows the difference. Recharging feels like restoration, and retreating feels too much like relief that slowly curdles into something flatter, numbness, and disconnection. If you've ever spent a weekend completely alone and come out of it feeling vaguely worse instead, that's worth paying attention to also as useful information about oneself, not as a judgment. The people who seem to navigate solitude best are the ones who don't treat it as an identity. They're not loners. They're just tending to something the way you'd water a plant. They go inward and then come back, usually more regulated, present, and capable of actual intimacy. Because intimacy requires presence, and that requires you to not completely deplete yourself performing connection that you didn't have the energy for. In a world that monetizes your attention and profits from your boredom, that engineered entire platforms specifically to make stillness feel unbearable, choosing to be alone with your own thoughts undistracted is maybe one of the more countercultural things a person can do. So, if you felt that relief when the plans got canceled, if you've always felt slightly more yourself in the quiet than the crowd, I'm not here to tell you that a superpower, since that framing is just as reductive as the one that called a flaw. What I will say is this. It's your nervous system and your psychology and your particular way of being in the world telling you something about what you need. And the only mistake, the one that actually costs you, is spending so long defending that preference or hiding it or worse, apologizing for it, that you never actually use it. If any of this genuinely resonated, not just intellectually, but in that quieter place where you actually recognize yourself, then you're probably someone who thinks deeply about this stuff, which means you'll find a lot more value in my other psychology simplified videos on the screen now. Subscribe if you haven't already and hit the join button if you want to help keep these psychology deep dives going. Subscribe my channel and press the bell icon.